This week on Life and Faith.
It's creating its own little enclave of you can work, rest and play here. And this is the type of lifestyle you have to live in order to sustain this life of being in the middle of the city. But the apartments are 22 floors above the actual retail bit. And so it's this strange dynamic of let's enjoy the best bits of the city, but let's not engage with the reality of it.
The systems that we trust in to know have broken down.
You know that the local social services are in trouble because they're phoning us and we've already got 6 kids in the house.
But I've learned that even when it doesn't go well, I can be okay.
What's the best way to understand the world and to live in it?
Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toh.
We're riffing slightly on grand designs on Life and Faith this week. And today we're talking about buildings and the spaces we live in and how they express our ideals and aspirations. We'll also be touching on our connection, sometimes spiritual, sometimes profound, with architecture and the built environment. I'm looking forward to this, Justine.
Yeah, me too. Are there any particular places that you feel a strong connection to?
Well, I have to admit, I can relate somewhat to the being a big sports fan, to the idea of the sacred turf of Wembley Stadium,
really?
Or the SCG or the MCG. Yeah, I can, but I know that's probably not what you're thinking of today.
Okay, so anything else then?
Yes, I love the thought of the attachment we have to places. It could be your home, perhaps the home you grew up in, and the memories and all the things and the emotion that's attached to those places. It seems that the space itself is something significant about that. I believe in something powerful and profound going on for us when we remember those things. They're important to us.
Yeah, definitely. I remember a friend of ours, their beloved family home was sold once the elderly mother passed away. And I remember at a family gathering, I asked the guy, how do you feel about your home? It's no longer your home, but you've lived so much of your life there. And he said that sometimes he drives there and sits outside. Can you imagine? In his car. And
I've done the same thing, actually.
Yeah, and it's strange because, if you hear that on paper and you're like, oh, it's, is that something you want to be seen doing necessarily?
Probably not.
But yeah, it really does resonate that we have that strong attachment to those places where so much went down, where we became the people we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And the events, those moments that are so significant to you. Yeah, I wonder if there's something about the space itself. I remember talking to a minister of a church that had burnt down, and he was really struck by how significant that was for so many people who'd had parts of it might be their weddings, the baptism of their children, whatever it might have been, funerals. They were devastated by the loss, and it meant more to them than just the physical building itself.
Which people probably didn't realise, perhaps, until it was gone.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Well, today on Life and Faith, we're bringing you a chat that Justine had with Kamila Soh, who's pursuing a Master's in Architectural History at the University of New South Wales, as well as teaching there, and in recent years at the University of Notre Dame.
Yeah, what kicked all of this off was an article that Kamila wrote in the Catholic Weekly that I found. She was writing about how there's this plan for a new luxury set of apartments above the old David Jones building in Sydney. And so she was kind of reflecting in that column what it would be like that you've got the new luxury apartments, you've got Hyde Park in Sydney, a very prominent kind of park in Sydney. And then on the other side of that, you've got St. Mary's Cathedral. And she was almost reflecting on what kind of conversation these two structures might have with each other in terms of what they project, the values they project, and their aspirations as well. But
fascinating sort of dynamic there.
Yeah, no, totally. But I have to apologise in advance. This is a very Sydney-centric episode. We're going to be hearing about Sydney Opera House, Sculptures by the Sea, Vivid Festival, so these sorts of events in the Sydney calendar. And I will say that the episode does slightly rely on familiarity with Sydney City, places like Market Street, Martin Place, Hyde Park. But having said all that, I have to say that Kamila is actually from Perth, and she's the one who brings up all these places. So
we can get away with it.
I hope you can accept my disclaimer. I started our chat by asking her if there was a building or public space that she feels a connection to.
I really like the General Post Office on Martin Place in Sydney. I just find that it's such a beautiful and grand building, and there's this sense of the arcades and how they invite the people to kind of, linger and to be in that public space. And I think it's also very historically significant because the General Post Office was actually the building that created Martin Place and created that civic space in Sydney. So it has that beautiful grand feel, it has that kind of old world quality about it. And, just even going inside, there's this kind of sense of theatricality and just that kind of liveliness that I really love. So I think that's a building that I've always found really quite beautiful in Sydney.
Can you expand more on what you just said about how the post office created Martin Place?
Sure. So actually the government architect at the time, James Barnett, when he was creating the General Post Office, the road at the time was quite narrow and there were these old buildings around. And so James Barnett, having been trained in England, he really wanted to create this idea of civic space in Sydney. And there wasn't really anything like it at the time. So he actually proposed for, these buildings to be knocked down in front of Martin Place. At the time when he was building it, it didn't happen, but eventually it got put in place. And, that whole plan about expanding Martin Place down to Macquarie Street became more of an idea. And it eventually happened. So it was really actually the General Post Office that was the beginning of that.
Oh, wow. And so this is early 20th century?
1800s.
Oh, 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so strange because Martin Place is such a key site where,
exactly,
the Anzac Day style memorials happen as well.
And I guess it's really interesting because, obviously the General Post Office was a post office. And at that time, it had so much more significance than what we know now because we're so used to, just having online shopping and so forth. But back in the day, everyone went there to post mail. That was the only place where people could have a connection to the wider world. And so that's why it was imbued with such kind of civic significance and meaning. Even the arcades and so forth were created to invite people in and, the ornaments and things. And it was actually seen as this center point where Sydney could connect to the world. And so it was actually, that's part of the reason why it was envisioned that, Martin Place would evolve from this because it was such a central part of Sydney life at the time.
So, Kamila, if I was a student in one of your classes,
yes,
can you give me a working definition of civic life? What do we mean when we say these words?
Okay, so civic life, so I'll connect it to Aristotle, the philosopher at the time. He was talking about his politics and he distinguished between what we call the private realm and the public realm. And so the private realm is the place of the home. So, where you have the relationships between, the husband and the wife, the children, the servants, and so forth. And that was seen as very kind of set dynamic, whereas in the public realm, that was where people would come together in public from different places, different backgrounds, and so forth. And it was the place where people would dialogue and, come to ideas about, how to rule society. So I guess really the beginnings of democracy. People have these dialogues about, how to live in the city together, how to kind of navigate the kind of social issues and so forth that arise.
Yeah, right. So it's about how we live together, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let me bring you to this fabulous opinion piece you had published in the Catholic Weekly fairly recently. You were talking about how St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney is getting quite a glamorous high-rise neighbour on the other side of Hyde Park.
Yes.
So on the other side of Hyde Park is the former David Jones flagship Sydney store, but it's going to get a set of high-rise apartments on top of it. Can you tell us, why did this grab your attention?
Yeah, so it's actually really funny. When I set out to write the article, that wasn't actually my original intention to write about 111 Castlereagh.
Which is the set of high-rise apartments.
Yes, it is, yeah. So I read this book by James K.A. Smith called You Are What You Love. And in that book, he talks about something called a secular liturgy. And so a secular liturgy is essentially something like a shopping centre or even a big stadium and so forth, where you actually realise that in the same way that you're formed in a church where, you might do things like pray and kneel and, listen to the liturgy, in the secular liturgy, you're also formed by the practices that are around you. So say
in those stadium or shopping centre spaces.
So say, for example, like a shopping centre, he talks about how people are kind of fed into this mode of consumerism when they go into a store where they're made to feel like, a particular product is going to fulfill them, is going to complete them. And so they consume this thing thinking that it will fulfill them, and they leave and they just kind of feel empty and they're drawn to entering into that spiral again and again. So James K.A. Smith talks about how these secular liturgies in the world are actually forming people as much as they would if you go to a church.
Okay, so then can you set side by side for us what's the sort of liturgy, as you put it, of this glamorous high-rise, 111 Castlereagh, versus St Mary's Cathedral? Because you did kind of spell this out in your piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just really interesting because 111 Castlereagh, when I was reading about it, like the developers were saying things like, back in the day, people worked from 9 to 5 and that was the standard working hours. But nowadays, people work from 9 to 6 a.m. And so we have to be able to cater for them and, have food downstairs and have a concierge to be able to cater for their social life so that they can organize it if they don't have the energy to.
Oh, wow.
And so it's almost as if the actual building itself and the way it's designed. So, it's kind of like luxury shopping downstairs and premium office spaces. And then you have upstairs 22 stories of apartments that are, like one apartment sold for 35 million. So, in kind of setting that standard for this luxury living, for this prime living in the city, it's almost as if it's creating its own little enclave of you can work, rest and play here, and this is the type of lifestyle you have to live in order to sustain this life of being in the middle of the city, being able to enjoy the best of it. But then I guess it's really interesting because the apartments are 22 floors up above the actual retail bit, and so it's quite interesting because in a sense they talk about the apartments as having this beautiful views, all these premium, like the Hyde Park and St. Mary's and all these other icons of the city. But then you can also be comfortable in your luxury and in your sophisticated apartment. And so it's kind of almost
you can see the city, but you don't have to engage with it in
exactly.
a way.
It's this strange dynamic of let's enjoy the best bits of the city, but let's not engage with the reality of it and, the kind of busyness and the chaoticness of the city itself. And so it's this strange dynamic of wanting to allow a person to live in the city at the expense of being very removed from its actual life. And, I guess St. Mary's I saw as a contrast to that because, people do get annoyed sometimes about, people coming in and sometimes you have tourists and all that stuff like during the liturgy and people get annoyed. But,
So you mean while there's a service?
Yeah, while there's
of
a
some
service.
kind. Yeah.
But the thing is that in itself shows that it is in the middle of urban life and it is kind of steeped in that urban life and doesn't close itself from it. So it's just really interesting that I guess these two buildings I saw had very different visions of how a person is meant to engage in the city and be able to live in it.
You're about to hear Kamila make reference to QVB, but of course this may not be that familiar to people who don't live in Sydney. I should have asked her to clarify this, but I just didn't want to break her train of thought. So she means the Queen Victoria building in central Sydney. It's quite a grand destination these days, right in the centre of the city. But it wasn't always this way. So back to Kamila again.
It's really fascinating because actually Market Street itself has a very interesting history in the sense of how it's evolved in terms of its public spaces because where QVB used to be was actually the first central marketplace in Sydney. People would go there for their food and for buying everything. So it was like this public realm in the very traditional sense. But then obviously as time went by and as the city expanded, that need for that central public market wasn't necessary anymore. And so, you have in the 1920s, things like the State Theatre that introduced cinema and David Jones at the time that, was so exciting because it was the first lift and, people would actually go there for day trips and, it was an actual kind of like excursion for them.
Yeah.
And so you kind of start with this excitement of, industrialization brings, but then essentially that keeps evolving into something that becomes more of like a luxury market. And so something that really struck me as I was walking down Market Street and doing my research is that when you leave Hyde Park, is literally everything you see on the street is just luxury brands. So like Prada, Miu Miu, it's like all those ones. And it's like there's nothing for the everyday person. All the spaces for the everyday person is either in the shopping centre or like, upstairs on like, the top floor, the bottom floor. It's almost as if the actual spaces that cater to everyone are hidden and the only spaces that have a place on the street front are the ones that are luxury brands. And so I actually saw that 111 Castlereagh was almost like, that on steroids.
The realisation of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're listening to Life and Faith from CPX. We're hearing Justine's chat with Kamila Soh about how buildings and public spaces tell a story about the city, what we value, who belongs, and what we aspire to.
This is an extraordinary building that had a remarkable birth. The competition for the Sydney Opera House took place in the late 1950s, and the building took 14 years to construct. I have to say, I've seen some long projects, but this probably takes the cake.
Wow.
What Utzon magically did was so avant-garde and so unlike anything else on the planet that would come to be an icon, an emblem for the country.
That, of course, was Kevin McLeod from Grand Designs. He visited the Opera House in 2018 to see how its renovations were proceeding. Now, Kamila's research for her Masters also concerns the Opera House. She aims to explore how the building expressed civic ideals of the time. But what does that mean?
The Sydney Opera House, that was, the competition came out in around 1957. And so at that time, that was obviously following, World War II and a lot of the worldwide efforts at the time to rebuild cities that were destroyed. And obviously in rebuilding cities, and having come from, things like the Nazi regime and so forth, a lot of architects and artists at the time were really wanting to create things that would reflect more of, more spaces that invited people to be able to, express themselves, to be able to kind of have public demonstrations and so forth. I guess part of that is that architects also wanted to create buildings that would reflect more of a quality of creativity, of freedom of expression. And so all of these things were kind of bubbling on the surface when the Sydney Opera House competition was instigated. What I'm doing in my research is I'm trying to understand the Sydney Opera House in that context, and in that context of, how was that idea of freedom of expression expressed both in its architecture and in the public spaces that were being created around it.
Okay, because I immediately think of how No War was written
absolutely
on the sails of the Sydney Opera House in protest against the Iraq War, I think. So that would have been 2003 maybe. But are you saying that this is a realization of what maybe was on the radar of people trying to build the Sydney Opera House?
I guess it's funny you say that because, in 1943, so this was when a document called the 9 Points of Monumentality was written. And it was a theorist, it was written with 3 people, but then the main theorist I'm looking at is Siegfried Gideon. And he actually talks about this idea of buildings being built with this broad kind of and wide surfaces where projections could be made or murals could be put on by artists to be able to, engage with the public, to be able to kind of reflect the spirit of the time. I remember reading that and being like, oh, this is written in 1940, but here I am in Sydney and, back when I just moved here in 2017 and I'm going, this is being realized 70 years after. And that's so fascinating. And I guess from my research, it doesn't seem like Jon Utzon, so he was the person who designed the Sydney Opera House. I don't think he had that in mind, but just the fact that, the Sydney Opera House was almost created as this sculptural entity where, it's put on this platform where you can basically see it from all sides, has these kind of wide public spaces around it so that you can behold it as a monument. And it's almost as if that dynamic itself and the way that it's designed actually then lends itself to that form of expression. So things like Vivid Festival, it's very much I couldn't imagine Vivid Festival without the Sydney Opera House. And the fact that you always see those pictures of the sails and the projections and so forth whenever Vivid Festival comes. And so it's so interesting that even with a festival like that, where it's working with very temporal means of projections and so forth, it still requires those permanent institutions, those permanent monuments to be able to make a statement, to be able to have a place in creating that public life and creating that activity.
And I think I'm right in saying that Vivid was initially like a midwinter sort of event. So inside, when the urge is to stay home and to rug up, it's like, no, come to the city, experience it, take a photo of it, right? But I believe that you sometimes have mixed feelings about our consumption of these spaces as well, right? We take the selfie outside of Vivid and then we post it on Instagram, right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so, I just think it's quite interesting because obviously in the 1940s when Siegfried Gideon was writing about projections and buildings, he didn't have Instagram on mind. And I guess it's quite fascinating that what would have been an ideal kind of means of creating that, civic life, those festivities and so forth, it has been transformed by the presence of social media and the way that we now engage in public space, in the sense that sometimes we primarily engage with public space through our phones.
Yeah.
I still remember when I first moved to Sydney, I was so shocked when I went to Sculptures by the Sea, and I was in Tamarama and I saw this platform and I was a bit curious, so I climbed up and I saw that there was a plaque there and it said, "This platform is here so that you can take photos for your Instagram."
Oh,
Like,
wow.
that was literally the only reason why that structure was built.
Yeah.
And so I just find it so fascinating that nowadays a lot of our art, a lot of our architecture, a lot of the projections that we see, it's not so much that we enjoy them for themselves and we attend to the content that's being put there. It's really just about creating an Instagram experience and about creating this sense of, you want people to take a picture, you want people to post it, and, you want that kind of civic dialogue to happen more online rather than in person. So I just find that very bizarre. And
Yeah.
I just feel like there's something that's not quite right about that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's another way in which our public spaces become reflections of what we want and what we prioritize, right? We
absolutely.
want to be able to navigate the world through our phones. Now, as we record this, we've seen cities around the world emptied because of lockdown. And I think that there are now plans underway to sort of revitalise the Sydney Central Business District here anyway and elsewhere. What aspirations would you like to see as we go forward in terms of our aspirations for public space and how to bring life back to the city?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely think being able to bring people back into the city, but not so much to kind of just, have this experience of, seeing a building with lights and then going away. I think we have to then introduce activities and so forth in that space to be able to allow people, invite people to kind of linger, invite people to actually connect with each other. So, things that, will actually facilitate conversation, or say, for example, even if you had something like Vivid, to at least have other things around like food stalls, or maybe even talks of things that would, be thought-provoking or create conversation, because I think that's what people are missing. They're coming into the cities, but they're not actually engaging with each other. So I think if we do have these things, we need to have these other things to be able to allow people to dialogue, to be able to actually enjoy each other's company, especially because we've really been lacking in that over the past few years.
What's the role of the church in all this? Now, Camilla's already spoken about St Mary's Cathedral being a genuinely public space open to everyone versus the exclusivity of those luxury apartments planned for Castlereagh Street. But what about the way we feel about buildings like churches, even if we're not particularly religious? Almost 3 years ago, Notre Dame Cathedral caught on fire during Holy Week. It was a shocking scene, Justine. You remember this well, of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember you wrote about it, right? It was.
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was writing about it at Easter, and I was trying to sort of look at the desolation of Good Friday, which the burning of the cathedral seemed to capture that so beautifully, but also the kind of pointing towards the rebuilding as symbolic of the hope of Easter Sunday. But it was a very kind of moving time, wasn't it? There was a journo at the time, American journalist, who wrote about this and said, "Why has the burning of Notre Dame moved so many?" And he went on to say, "Because we believe in beauty, majesty, faith, art, history, and the human expressions thereof. We recognise in this cathedral our common humanity." And then, quite profoundly, "A scar now emerges in our connections to our past, our future, and each other." And I think that's largely what we're talking about here. And we saw extraordinary scenes, not just then of the devastation, but of people gathered outside this famous iconic building, and they cried, they prayed, they comforted each other, and they sang hymns.
I think what was really fascinating that I found about the burning of Notre Dame is that, obviously I was in Sydney at the time, and I knew so many people who were upset about it, even people who maybe hadn't been there before and so forth. So I just found, wow, how is it that a building that's not even part of an everyday person's life can be so, I guess the loss of it can be so deeply felt and so deeply mourned. And I also think it's because, like as human beings, we don't just kind of walking around these abstract values and ideals and so forth. Like those things are represented in the things that we create. So, things like art, things like architecture. And I think when that's destroyed, there's almost kind of like a fundamental shift where like we kind of feel, I personally feel this kind of violation where it's like, like the physical fabric has now shifted and like, this thing that represented my values that is attached to like this thing that I'm a part of is suddenly gone. And, like the representation of that and that presence of that. And so I think that's why, like even though perhaps, the faith is kind of waning in France, it's still very much a part of their culture, it's still very much a part of their history. And so to lose that monument is almost like losing a part of your identity.
You mean as the city?
As a city and even as a person, because you grow up again, like being nourished like physically by these institutions and kind of knowing that, if when you look at a church, okay, that's part of, maybe perhaps not part of my personal life, but part of the life of my ancestors, part of the life that my parents grew up with. And so there's almost a part of your personal history that's destroyed when that goes
wrapped
away.
Up in that. Well, I mean, gosh, it's was made in the 12th century. So this is what's gone down in that time, just to give a glimpse. Crusades, the Renaissance, French Revolution, 2 world wars. So it's seen as the heart of the city.
Absolutely.
In some ways. And so there's a lot of culture, there's a lot of world history that is bundled up in that place.
And it's pretty amazing as well that, Notre Dame still remained as such a prominent monument, especially following the French Revolution and so forth. So the fact that
which was quite secular, you mean? Like
trying to, And so the fact that it even persisted through that and has still, like had its place in the civic realm, I think is very significant. So the fact that, this thing had persisted and has now was destroyed, I think was a real shock to people,
Yeah. People often talk about how churches can offer space for contemplation.
Yeah.
Like people might, whip out their phones and make notes or read or Instagram the beautiful, features, etc. But that's an interesting thought as well, right? Like in a city where we're otherwise assaulted by stimulation, maybe the provision of a vast, empty, quiet space that might kind of help your thoughts lift to the ultimate. Maybe this is a particular kind of contribution that the church can make. What do you think about that?
Well, it's funny you say that, Justine, because the renovations for Notre Dame right now, they're actually considering the projection of Bible verses in the church.
Okay, so what do you think about that?
I think that actually reflects the fact that as a society, we've lost our capacity for contemplation. Like we've lost the capacity to just be still in a place and be able to just be present and to just pray, and that we have to somehow have these visual and technological aids to help us to do that. Because, you can even see that in art galleries, like if you go to a show, it's like sometimes you have to have like a little string quartet playing in the background or, have these kind of visual video animations to tell you the story about the artist. And so there isn't that sense of allowing people that silence to be able to just be still and to be in a place. And I think, unfortunately, that's being reflected in the proposed renovations for the Notre Dame church.
Right, okay. So this is interesting because perhaps if churches are trying to think about how do they make themselves responsive to the needs of the 21st century city, it sounds like you're saying remain in the 12th century in a way, right? Like be vast and empty and cold and don't distract people. Is that what you might say?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, what is the space of contemplation? Is that even a thing now, or is that something of the past? But I think, I don't know, like even in lockdown, I knew so many people who would talk about, they'd go for all these daily walks and, they'd go to the park and experience nature and appreciate that again. And so many people I knew, which was really interesting, a lot of them were like, we're just so sick of our phones. We're just so sick of all the noise and having to be on our phones all the time. And we just wanted, time off the screen and just quality time with people. So I think that desire for silence, that desire for deeper connection or even for deeper thinking is instilled in every human person. And perhaps we try to find it in different ways, but essentially I think is always something that we'll never be able to kind of get rid of, like even though, sure, maybe it was manifest in the 12th century through, like cathedrals and so forth. But I think even now, the fact that, there's the whole movement towards mindfulness, there's the whole idea of people kind of now, deleting social media and so forth. I think there is still something within us that yearns for that. And I think that's being seen in the way that people are responding to the fact that we have been in this technology saturated place, like especially during lockdown, and seeing the limitations of what that can offer us.
Yeah, so a move towards spaces that help us to think and be quiet. Wow, what an innovation with all our thirst for the new and the kind of stimulating. But it may be that what we need right now is to be
even
quiet.
on an everyday level, like when people working in the city and so forth, like I usually see people go to Hyde Park or, go down to Circular Quay for their lunch break, and, they're just sitting in front of the water or the park and just eating their sandwich and not doing anything. And I can see that, that's probably the only time of, I guess, real quiet and rest that they can take from their working hours in that day. So you can see that it's still ingrained in every person. And, like if possible, each one of us are usually longing for that and try to find opportunities for that in our daily lives.
You've been listening to Life and Faith from CPX with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Yes, and thank you, Kamila, for coming into the CPX studio to record this interview. It was really exciting for me because this was my first in-person chat since lockdown, which is always far better than doing it over Zoom. I'm going to post a link to Camila's piece on St Mary's Cathedral and the 111 Castlereagh development in the Catholic Weekly, as well as some other pieces she's published on ABC Religion and Ethics.
At CPX, we're having conversations about things that matter, and if you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with a friend and leave us a rating or review. It helps people discover our show. Next week.
I had been a professor for 8 or so years before things started to take a turn for the worse. For several years, the reality kind of lived up to the dream. But at some point, I would wake up in the morning just filled with dread. For reasons that I didn't fully understand. It was no longer the dream job that I had once had.